In 2020, Tokyo Disneyland's new Fantasyland finally opened and the stunning Beauty and the Beast ride enchanted the world. But we could have had an Alice ride instead? That's right, the original new Fantasyland plans had some stuff that was very different to what eventually got built. Some that was very similar, and some that was just insane. But what was different and why was it so crazy? I'm Jordan at 8-Bit Theme Park Japan, and in this video I'm going to talk about the crazy new Fantasyland Tokyo Disneyland almost had. For those who don't know, New Fantasyland was a term used to describe the 2020 expansion to Tokyo Disneyland, the largest expansion in the park's 40-year history, so far. And although it was occasionally referred to as the park's New Fantasyland, the marketing didn't lean into this name as much as they did in the Magic Kingdom's 2012 expansion in Florida. This is because the expansion Tokyo Disneyland got didn't just consist of Fantasyland. Whilst the majority of the space and budget went to the huge Enchanted Tale of Beauty and the Beast dark ride, Gaston's Tavern, the village shops, the rest of the village, and the Fantasyland Forest Theatre, all of which unsurprisingly exist in Fantasyland, the enormous expansion also consisted of additions to Tomorrowland and Toontown, with Baymax's Happy Ride, Flat Ride, and the Big Pop Popcorn Shop in Tomorrowland, and the quaint and playful Minnie's-style studio meet and greet in Toontown. These additions were very surprising, as in the original plans, Toontown was going to be almost completely flattened. So, you probably have a lot of questions about what was going to happen here, but before we get into that, if you enjoy nostalgic video games, then I'm sure you'll love the 8-Bit Theme Park store, where we have t-shirts, mugs, bags, and more. Find the link in the description below. As for what was going to happen to Toontown, well, we can see that from some of the original artwork that came with the first announcement of a Tokyo Disneyland expansion. Mickey and Minnie's houses are still there, as well as what seems to be the town hall, but the rest of what is now Toontown looks very different. This is the part of the artwork that has the least detail, so I suspect they hadn't really decided on what exactly they were going to do, but were up for evicting Roger and doing something very different with the rest of downtown Toontown. On a side note, when I was there recently, I was admiring the balcony that was originally designed to be an outdoor second floor portion of the cartoon spin ride, but was cut back in America, and I was thinking, if Tokyo Disney built that now, they'd have paid to have the enhanced version of the ride instead of just copying California's. As I said, the artwork in Toontown is kind of vague. I think this would have been more of a phase 2 after some of the other stuff. One thing I can't really work out from here though is whether or not this is Gadget's Go Coaster or something else. I'm guessing they were thinking of re-theming it, but anyway, here comes the crazy part of that expansion. It's a Small World isn't here, but it gets even crazier. They weren't just going to flatten It's a Small World, they were going to rebuild it next to Tomorrowland. Just take a second to take that in. They were going to flatten one of the largest rides in the park just to rebuild it a 5-minute walk away. You're probably starting to see why this never happened. The new placement for It's a Small World was actually genius though. I've always thought that if Disneyland in California had more space in Tomorrowland after the 1964 World's Fair, they'd probably have built It's a Small World there instead of Fantasyland. I'd like to think that the children of the world living together in harmony is something that Walt would have wanted in his optimistic vision of the future, rather than the land of magic and make-believe. Funnily enough, now that It's a Small World is full of Disney characters, it does fit in better in Fantasyland than it ever has before. Where were we? Yeah. So they wanted to move It's a Small World. It definitely would have given us a much more subtle and smooth transition between Fantasyland and Tomorrowland than the sudden jump cut we ended up with. I mean, come to think of it, the whole original plan seems to have a much better flow between Fantasyland and Tomorrowland than the kind of hodgepodge we ended up with. We'll get into why they wanted to move It's a Small World and what they were going to do with that huge space a bit later, but you may have noticed that isn't the only ride they wanted to move. Dumbo the Flying Elephant also has a new space on the corner near Pooh's Honey Hunt, which I think would have been a really nice spot for it. And more importantly, this would have meant it's not right next to the Haunted Mansion, blaring cheery tunes at the delightfully unlivable retreat. You know what that means? The west side of Fantasyland would just be Haunted Mansion and Tokyo's scarier version of Snow White's Adventures. Imagine a spooky side of Fantasyland, that sounds awesome. And it's an example of how this expansion would have changed more than just what you can see in this artwork. And there's a lot in this artwork. So, part of it that actually stayed the same and got built is clearly Beast's Castle. The Imagineer who headed up the expansion, Jim Clark, has said in interviews that the Beauty and the Beast ride was the one thing that OLC were dead set on from the start, and this artwork would confirm that. It's very hard to tell what the village surrounding the castle would have consisted of, but there's definitely a lot more to it here than what eventually got built. To the right, I'd guess that this is the theatre we actually ended up with. These other buildings I think would be the shops and eateries that we got too, but further down is where it gets very different. In the area that is currently home to the Big Pop and Tomorrowland Terrace dining locations is this waterway through some European-looking houses and castle spires. This seems to be another part of the artwork which is purposefully vague. Some have suggested it would have been an outdoor water ride like Storybook Canal boats, but it's hard to say. I do really like that this would have made the border between Fantasyland and Tomorrowland a straight line though, instead of the mess we ended up with, like I said earlier. Okay, so we've already talked about how they wanted to move It's a Small World, but what would they have done with one of the largest ride footprints in the entire park? The entire resort even. Well, it seems that Belle's Village wouldn't have been the only mini-land in Fantasyland. OLC sure do love mini-lands, don't they? So right now, we have the Queen of Hearts Banquet Hall and Alice's Tea Party, which are right next to each other, but then It's a Small World is kind of in the way. So the idea was to make this into a mini Wonderland, with the ride replacing It's a Small World, presumably another e-ticket dark ride. Imagining a high-budget Alice in Wonderland dark ride based on the original 1951 animated movie sounds incredible, and I really hope this gets realized at some point. There have been rumors of one going to Shanghai Disneyland's Fantasyland too, but I think this was the area that they now built Zootopia. I'm sure this area would have been so much fun. As you can see from this artwork here, it would have been totally transformed from the current open concrete to a land of whimsy and fun. And who knows what this Alice ride could have been? I certainly have plenty of ideas, and I'd love to see some of yours in the comments. Another proposal in this original expansion plan was something that's probably not so exciting to you and me, but would have been very exciting to a lot of local fans here. It was a restaurant which overlooks the parade route. We don't have any of those here, and the parades and entertainment are a huge deal in Tokyo Disney Resort. Trust me, people are getting there at 3 a.m. right now to see the parades, so yeah, this restaurant would have been hugely popular. And actually, I think it could still happen. So right next to the parade route now is Maurice's house, which was where the FastPass machines were. Actually, they still are there, but they've never, ever been used. So I could definitely see them flattening this building and using that space for something that makes the most of this really good view of the parade. So why did this incredible expansion end up getting downsized to just the Beauty and the Beast ride, Baymax ride, a theater, and a meet and greet? Okay, saying just for all of that is kind of a lot, but yeah. Well, at the same time as this, OLC, the owners and operators of Tokyo Disney Resort, also announced an expansion for Tokyo Disney Sea, but that wasn't what they ended up building there either. This small frozen port got a lukewarm reception from fans, which I guess inspired OLC to rethink their plans, and rather than adding capacity to Tokyo Disneyland, the more popular park, I guess they changed their minds and thought, well, let's try and make Disney Sea more popular instead, and give families more of a reason to go by bringing some of those familiar Disney characters into that park. If you want to learn more about the Fantasy Springs expansion coming to Disney Sea, which dwarfs this Disneyland expansion, then you'll want to watch this video next.